In the annals of true crime, few figures are as chilling as Dr. Marcel Petiot. Known as the Butcher of Paris, Petiot was a French physician who used the horrors of World War II as a cover for his gruesome crimes. To his neighbors and patients, he appeared to be a kind and respectable doctor. But behind the closed doors of his Parisian home, Petiot carried out a macabre series of murders that shocked the world. In this episode, we will delve into the twisted mind of Marcel Petiot, explore the dark history of his deeds, and uncover the cunning methods he used to lure his victims to their deaths. From his early life and medical career to his descent into murder and the eventual unraveling of his crimes, we will take you through the life of a man who became one of France's most notorious serial killers. This story is not just about the crimes themselves, but also about the chaotic backdrop of Nazi-occupied France, where desperation and fear made Petiot's victims easy prey. Marcel-André Henri Félix Petiot was born on January 17, 1897, in Auxerre, a small town in the Burgundy region of France. His childhood was marked by troubling behavior, with reports suggesting that he exhibited signs of antisocial tendencies from a young age. Petiot was expelled from multiple schools for disruptive behavior, and by the time he was a teenager, he had already developed a reputation as a troublemaker. Despite these early warning signs, Petiot was highly intelligent and showed a particular aptitude for academics. He completed his schooling with the help of a tutor and later enrolled in the University of Paris to study medicine. During World War I, Petiot served in the French army, where he was injured and subsequently diagnosed with a variety of psychological disorders, including kleptomania and amnesia. However, these diagnoses did not prevent him from completing his medical degree in 1921. Petiot's early medical career was relatively unremarkable, but there were already signs of the darkness that would later define his life. He practiced medicine in Villeneuve-sur-Yonne, where he gained a reputation for being both compassionate and unconventional. Petiot was known for his willingness to perform illegal abortions and for prescribing addictive drugs to his patients. His practices were ethically dubious at best, but they endeared him to many in the community, who saw him as a doctor who was willing to take risks to help his patients. However, Petiot's time in Villeneuve-sur-Yonne was not without scandal. In 1926, he was implicated in the theft of a town councillor's money, though the charges were later dropped due to lack of evidence. Around this time, he also married Georgette Leblay, the daughter of a wealthy landowner, further cementing his status in the community. In 1933, Petiot moved to Paris, where he opened a medical practice in the affluent 16th arrondissement. He quickly built a successful practice, catering to the wealthy and elite of Parisian society. His charm and charisma made him popular among his patients, and he soon became known as Dr. Eugene in his neighborhood. But behind this facade of respectability, Petiot was already beginning to plan his most heinous crimes. The transition from respected physician to serial killer is often difficult to pinpoint, but in Petiot's case, it seems to have been a gradual process. His early criminal activities were largely financial in nature: embezzlement, theft, and fraud. He exploited his position of trust as a doctor to steal from his patients, often targeting those who were elderly or terminally ill. Petiot's crimes escalated as the political and social turmoil of the 1930s intensified. By the time France fell to Nazi Germany in 1940, Petiot had developed a plan that would allow him to profit from the desperation of those seeking to escape the horrors of the occupation. Under the guise of helping Jews and other fugitives flee to safety, Petiot lured his victims into a deadly trap. Petiot presented himself as a member of the French resistance, claiming to have connections that could secure safe passage to South America. He charged exorbitant fees for his services, which included falsified documents and instructions for evading the Nazis. His victims were told to bring their valuables with them, as these would be needed to fund their escape. What they didn't know was that once they entered Petiot's home, they would never leave. Petiot's home at 21 Rue Lesueur in Paris became the epicenter of his gruesome operations. The building, which had once been a clinic, was outfitted with soundproof rooms and a basement furnace. Victims were brought to the house under the pretense of receiving medical examinations or inoculations before their journey. Once inside, Petiot would administer lethal injections, telling his victims that the injections were vaccinations necessary for travel. After the victims were dead, Petiot would strip them of their possessions, including cash, jewelry, and clothing. The bodies were then dismembered and either incinerated in the furnace or disposed of in the Seine River. The ashes and other remains were often scattered in the garden or dumped in the surrounding area. In total, it is estimated that Petiot murdered between 60 and 200 people, though the exact number may never be known. For years, Marcel Petiot operated with impunity, shielded by the chaos of the war and the secrecy of his methods. However, his luck began to run out in 1944, when Parisians began to notice a foul smell emanating from 21 Rue Le Sueur. The building had long been a source of curiosity for neighbors, who had observed the steady stream of people entering but never leaving. In March 1944, French police, acting on a tip, raided Petiot's home. What they found was beyond anything they could have imagined. The house was filled with the dismembered remains of multiple victims, along with blood-stained tools and clothing. The furnace in the basement still contained human ashes, and there were signs that Petiot had attempted to hastily clean up the scene. Petiot was immediately placed under suspicion, but he managed to evade arrest by claiming that the bodies were those of enemies of the state who had been killed by the resistance. In the confusion of the liberation of Paris, Petiot went on the run, using false identities and his knowledge of the city's underworld to avoid capture. During his time on the run, Petiot continued to present himself as a resistance fighter, even going so far as to offer his services to the newly formed French government. However, his past eventually caught up with him, and he was arrested in October 1944. By this time, the full extent of his crimes had come to light, and the French public was horrified by the revelations. The trial of Marcel Petiot began in March 1946, and it quickly became one of the most sensational cases in French history. The courtroom was packed with spectators, journalists, and family members of the victims, all eager to see justice served. Petiot, ever the showman, maintained his composure throughout the proceedings, often smiling and making jokes. Petiot's defense hinged on his claim that he was a member of the resistance and that the people he had killed were collaborators or German agents. He insisted that the murders were carried out in the name of patriotism and that he was merely following orders. However, the evidence against him was overwhelming, and the prosecution was able to prove that Petiot had been motivated by greed rather than ideology. Witnesses testified to the elaborate ruse Petiot had used to lure his victims, and the court was presented with the gruesome details of how he had disposed of their bodies. The sheer number of victims, combined with the brutality of the murders, left little doubt as to Petiot's guilt. In May 1946, Marcel Petiot was found guilty of 26 counts of murder, though it is widely believed that he was responsible for many more. He was sentenced to death by guillotine, a punishment that was still in use in France at the time. On May 25, 1946, Petiot was executed at La Santé prison in Paris. He remained defiant until the end, reportedly telling the executioner, "I am an innocent man." His death marked the end of one of the darkest chapters in French criminal history, but the legacy of his crimes continues to haunt the nation to this day. The case of Dr. Marcel Petiot is a stark reminder of how easily evil can hide behind a facade of respectability. Petiot was able to carry out his crimes largely because of his position as a trusted physician and his ability to exploit the chaos of wartime France. His victims, many of whom were already vulnerable and desperate, were drawn into his web of deceit by the promise of safety and escape. Petiot's story also highlights the dangers of unchecked power and the ease with which someone in a position of authority can manipulate those who trust them. His actions were not just the result of a disturbed mind, but also of a calculated decision to use his medical knowledge for personal gain at the expense of others' lives. The impact of Petiot's crimes was felt long after his death. The families of his victims were left to grapple with the horrifying truth of what had happened to their loved ones, and the French public was forced to confront the realities of a nation in turmoil. Petiot's crimes became emblematic of the moral decay that can occur during times of war, where the lines between good and evil, right and wrong, become blurred. The story of Marcel Petiot didn't end with his execution. In the years following his death, his life and crimes have continued to capture the public's imagination. Numerous books, documentaries, and films have been produced, each attempting to understand what drove a seemingly respectable man to commit such heinous acts. Petiot's crimes also had a lasting impact on the legal and medical communities in France. His case underscored the need for stricter regulations and oversight in the medical profession, particularly concerning the psychological fitness of doctors. It also highlighted the potential for abuse in a system where individuals can wield significant power over others without adequate checks and balances. In popular culture, Marcel Petiot has been portrayed as the quintessential wolf in sheep's clothing, a man who used his charm, intelligence, and position to commit acts of unspeakable cruelty. His ability to maintain a double life, fooling not just his victims but also his family, friends, and colleagues, makes him one of history's most enigmatic and terrifying criminals. Even today, the name Marcel Petiot is synonymous with deception, manipulation, and murder. His story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting too easily, especially in times of crisis. It also raises important questions about the nature of evil. Was Petiot a product of his environment, driven to madness by the horrors of war, or was he simply a man who took advantage of a chaotic situation to satisfy his own dark desires? The case of Dr. Marcel Petiot is one of the most disturbing in the history of true crime. His ability to operate under the radar, despite the scale of his atrocities, speaks to the dark potential that exists within the human psyche. Petiot was not just a murderer. He was a master manipulator who exploited the fears and vulnerabilities of his victims for his own gain. As we reflect on the life and crimes of Marcel Petiot, we are reminded of the importance of vigilance, both in our personal lives and in society as a whole. The lessons learned from his story are as relevant today as they were in the 1940s. The need for skepticism in the face of too good to be true offers, the dangers of placing blind trust in authority figures, and the ever-present potential for evil to lurk behind the most benign of facades. If you found this video informative, please like and subscribe to our channel. In our next episode, we'll dive into the chilling case of Dr. Thomas Neil Cream, also known as the Lambeth Poisoner, a doctor whose medical practice became a cover for a series of lethal poisonings in Victorian England. Don't forget to tune in. This is one story you won't want to miss.